About it tonight. It's time for our breakout groups. And the way this will work is each of you have been assigned to groups, and the groups are timed. As soon as I start the group, it will go for 15 minutes. You will get a 1-minute warning that it's counting down, where we'll all be rejoined into the main group. Janice, did you want to say anything else about the breakouts?
Just that your facilitator has picked the question. We thought this would save time. And Nick, you want to talk a little bit about generational differences real quick?
Sure. So one of the topics is generational differences in the workplace. And what we focused on here is really how do generational workforce differences affect our ability to manage people? Something that we found is that, both of us, my aunt and I, are very strong leaders. We're both women in different industries that we work in, but we lead very, very differently. And that can affect your work relationships if you don't know how to communicate appropriately, or if there's certain things that you're just missing because you don't understand the generational difference. So that's really the key takeaway from your topic is how can you focus on that, and then how can you end up working together and handle those situations to benefit everybody.
Leadership styles is all about how to create mutual respect between the different generations of women. Perfect example, we've got baby boomer, a little older than baby boomer, traditionalist, Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, fighting with and in conflict and tension with Congresswoman AOC, who's a millennial. In the sports world, you've got Megan Rapinoe, who's terrific at soccer with her dropping the F-bomb and wearing her purple hair, but a fabulous supporter of women's equality and equity. And then you've got Kim Negg, who's the new Marlin general manager, who does it by the book with her pinstripe suit, plays with the boys, but successful. And finally, we talked a little bit before about vulnerability and authenticity and that role in dealing with failure. How do you reflect but not self-sabotage?
Here we go. I'm about to open all the breakout rooms.
I was going to ask you, do you see more women, really, like their sports announcers who are more women, their coaches and referees? I mean, do you see that breaking through for more women now?
I do, especially in, I would say, some of the male sports that have complementary female sports to them. So you'll see a lot more women who are joining the baseball scene. You'll see a lot more women joining the NBA. And obviously you see some of the women that are now becoming refs in the NFL. So for me and the athletic divisions, what I see is that once they break into sports like the baseballs, the footballs, the basketballs, they are able to just open the doors for some of those other sports and some of those other leadership roles within athletics. And it's been, we've gotten to hear from a number of those women speak. They've come and spoken to us at some conferences, and it's amazing now because they're creating their own leadership training programs to have women kind of follow in their footsteps, which is just expanding the amount of women participating at that level.
Can we give each facilitator a real brief amount of time to just say
Sure.
There's three, so you go first.
Okay, well, we had a nice discussion, and we talked about how sort of generational differences show up in the workplace, and how some of the younger generations are starting to figure out how to bring their authentic selves to a situation without sort of compromising their ability to be effective and successful. We talked about making sure that communication is key, that sharing our stories, sharing our perspectives bridges those gaps. We talked about how boomers were uncomfortable historically sharing their personal lives, and millennials and Gen Z are much more open to doing that. And then someone suggested that it's important to understand who your audience is and then tailor your message to the things that would be important to that person in order to effectuate an outcome that you would be excited about. And we talked about failure and how boomers kind of personalize it, and millennials seem to be a little bit better about sort of being more objective about it, which can be perceived by boomers not to take responsibility. So that's another area that requires bridging. Millennials and Gen Xers are more open to sharing information about mistakes and failures, and about other things as well. Like we talked about how boomers never used to talk about how much money they made, and millennials and Gen Xers might. So there's just a whole much more openness. So we had a nice conversation. We all agreed it's important to learn from each other.
How about Sherry?
Okay, hey, group 2, we talked about leadership styles and our main goal about mutual respect and understanding women in our different leadership styles. And it was great because I think ultimately most of the group, we talked about different ways of doing things. Nikki talked a lot about, the differences between Janice and her, about having an open door policy, one of them, and then modeling behavior. And I thought another common theme, like Felice just said, was Michelle brought up communications being the key, talking, making sure that we're always keeping each other in the loop. And it was really, really, really an important aspect of leadership. And we did talk a little bit about biases. I'm going to boil that down into, we talked about learning how to give it up, making sure that as a baby boomer, you realize you've had your time, you've done and you've achieved things, and be satisfied with what you achieved, and that people already recognize that, and that you can give that up to millennials so that they're able to then bring forward their leadership style. A lot of listening. We talked about how important listening is now that from a baby boomer standpoint, you have the style of being able to be a little bit more forceful. And I thought it was really interesting how Janet talked about her experiences as being one of the first women in even an all male board. And she talked about wanting to be perfect. And I think every single woman on this complete board is probably, no matter what age you are, you want to be perfect, but knowing that you don't have to be perfect, and that you're not going to be judged by but by the decisions that you make. And then we talked about also the very, very important style of coaching and carrying on the mentorship, whether you do that formally in a business or your own consulting, or whether you just do that as an individual and as a person. And then also we talked about how difficult where you're at in the market right now is, looking at that area that some of us are in the Sarasota area, it being kind of a small market, and there are still some biases there. So group 2 had a lot of great lively discussion, and then we talked a lot about the sports arena with Nicole's help. So thank you.
In the group, in group 3, if we did raise your hand, but I think we were post-millennial all the way up to pre-baby boomer. Perhaps I'm describing myself, we'll see. Anyway, we looked at failure, vulnerability, authenticity, dealing with failure and power structure. And so we were looking from the standpoint of a fair amount of collective failure. There was no one in the group that had not experienced a significant failure that they really struggled with. One of our members says, has any woman not felt this? I think there may be some other women who've not dealt with this, but I doubt it, because we were all sharing significant events in our careers in which we felt the huge impact of failure, or what we perceived as failure. And basically what we ended up with was a real appreciation for our collective resilience, which I will take the liberty of saying is there. It's conditioned in us, probably because we are women to begin with, but also because we are or have been women in the workplace, and we've had to develop resilience over the years. And so our group, in their discussions about their experiences, demonstrated great resilience and creativity in dealing with their perceptions of failure in their careers. One of us said it's the attitude after a disappointment that counts. Yes, we're going to be disappointed. It's the attitude, the response that we give that will determine if we at that point can move forward and do well, or if we retreat into a corner and don't do well. the person in our group that was probably the youngest said she decided after having missed several promotions that she was going to ask for feedback and why it mattered if she didn't get something that she wanted, that she was not going to wait to be given feedback. She was going to ask for it. That was a large lesson in her career. And so that may be coming fairly close to what those of us who are more senior in the group didn't bring up. So that may be edging a little bit towards the millennial perspective there. A couple of us are big fans of Brene Brown and her discussions about being vulnerable and being aware of our vulnerability and open to it. Several of us talked about the importance of sisterhood and how if we are able to open up whenever we are disappointed, we allow others to support us and help us, and also to understand that others have been or certainly will be in the same disappointing situations that we've experienced. We all said it's easy to look internally and say, what did I do wrong? Because we tend to take personal responsibility for things that we cannot control, as well as things that we do control. And white men don't think things through in the way that women and people of color do when they have to deal with disappointments, because they're carrying privilege. And so that is a quality, unfortunately, because we don't have that privilege or have not historically had that privilege. Unfortunately, that's resiliency is something that we've had to develop, but it also is a strength and makes us better leaders, and is something that, as I mentioned in the beginning, has become a quality that we've had to develop and is probably innate in women in the workplace because of that, and something to be aware of and confident about, and to realize that we have it, and to also help others to realize that they have it.
With Christina.
Well, Carol delivered a great speech, so I'm not going to share how I'm going to follow that one up. But I did want to follow up with if it was Janet that we were talking about, whether she's perfect or not. She's already checked that off. She's perfect, so she's good to go. You've succeeded, Janet. Our group spoke about leadership styles and how do we create those mutual respects and understandings among women based on different leadership styles themselves, as well as different generational gaps. And we really hit on 4 kind of different key takeaways. And I like how everyone spoke ahead and had mentioned a couple of things that we had hit. So obviously things integrate and they go. And the first one is kind of the external factor. And I know in our group, they mentioned it, and I think it's a good thing to hit, because it's something I think we all overlook, is how our society now does value those who speak out, who are the loudest, who have an answer the quickest. So we were talking about leadership styles of those who are more reflective, who may not be the first ones to raise their hand or the first ones to say something in a meeting, but it's not because they're scared or they have nothing to contribute. It's just a different style of leadership, that they're more reflective. So we were talking about that for quite a bit, and how do we essentially change our cultural our institutions now, who like instant gratification now that we have technology and we get answers right away. We want people to generate answers right away. How do we kind of change that perspective and bring those individuals up to the front? And I know Angela had a really great point where she said she has a couple of those people on her team, or when she has meetings, where she has decided to start giving, whether it's the agenda ahead of the time or a prompt question, or essentially the subject of what they're going to be speaking about, and kind of giving that individual heads up so they can marinate on the topic and be ready to speak at that meeting with the other individuals that love to just speak right out of the gate, so that those discussions are had a little bit ahead of time. So that was one of our main topics that we addressed. The second one, which I agree with, and it kind of comes down to that trailblazer, many of you who were the first in those corporate rooms. And so it's that leadership style of where probably, I would say my generation being millennial, we walk into a room, I think someone had said it was great, like, you guys are lucky to have us in the room. And those ahead of us are like, you should just feel lucky that you're in the room, right? So, because they had to work so hard to get into the room, and the doors are already essentially, because of, you know, the work that was done ahead of time, have already been opened, that we can't either, one, fully appreciate it or grasp it. So how do we get to that different mindset with women leaders, of those who said, you know, I had to, you know, basically claw my way in, prove my way in, work these many hours, and then you guys are coming in and saying, I'm here, you're lucky to have me, and here's all my ideas and thoughts. And so how do we have that where we don't have that animosity between those two different kind of perspectives? And I know Jan her and I had spoken about, like, even financial funding. We did speak about this in our group, about how it's just interesting to see those who actually do a lot of fundraising and donations, that a lot of women, senior women, actually don't give a lot of money who do have, because maybe they've worked so hard to make that money. They don't like to freely give to it, even for women causes at times. So that was one conversation, is like understanding that perspective from either or. We can't come in saying you're lucky to have us, knowing that there's people that are ahead of us who didn't have it as, I wouldn't even say as easy, but obviously who didn't have it as easy as we did coming in. And so having that, you know, respect that way as well, but also knowing that there's going to be the generation behind me who's going to be even worse than me. I'm gonna use that loosely, and that's a good thing, because that's progress. But, you know, to always keep that into kind of perspective. The third other topic that we had was essentially, and Angela hit this again, was tradition, right? How do we not lose things that we love from the older generation, but then add our tradition into it, or things that we have? Angela hit it really good, where she said, you know, effectively, that you can't carry all the traditions of the generations ahead of us and then expect to bring our own, because we'd just be too overwhelmed. So how do we have those conversations of what's the best, and finding that balance between old traditions and new traditions coming up in the workplace, to be the most effective for the context and where we're going? And last but not least, and we were really getting into this, and I know that Kathleen was really doing a really good job into it. Unfortunately, we were talking a little bit too much, but it was a good thing, is effectively, how do we not lose millennials? And it's that conversation you all had about communication. How do we not lose millennials who, we want to have that conversation, whether it's clothing attire, right? Necessarily, right? We think it might be business casual. You guys are like, no, that's not even close. How do we have those conversations with, not in a respectful way, and opening that door? So we had just started getting into that, which I thought was a really good topic, because it's from women who do want to lead younger women through that leadership style, but then are afraid that they're going to be taken as they're overbearing or they're micromanaging, when in true sense, they're just trying to teach those soft skills. So
my aunt and I have those conversations all the time about attire.
Well, this has been a fabulous session. I want to really thank Janice and Nicole for
Thank you all
preparation going
very
into
much.
it.
Participate.
Great
Thank you.
participation, everybody. I feel really uplifted by this whole session. I hope you do too. I didn't have a chance to